Our next presenter is Harold Doherty, and Harold will be presenting on why mainstream classrooms are unsafe learning environments for some autistic students. Harold is the father of a severely autistic 16-year-old son who, with the cooperation of school officials, removed his son from his grade 2 classroom because he was coming home each day with self-inflicted bite marks on his hands and wrists. A labor lawyer, autism advocate, and former Autism Society New Brunswick president, he participated in the McKay Inclusion Review and the Ministerial Review on Inclusive Education, where he advocated for a flexible inclusion policy and for recognition that mainstream classroom is not an appropriate learning environment for some children with autism. So Harold, the floor is yours.
What I have to say was just summarized quite aptly, and there are many people in this room who've heard me say it more than once over the last several years, last roughly 12 years, in a variety of settings. As mentioned, my son has severe autism, autistic disorder, which is the original classic autism before the change in definition of autism disorders began with the DSM-IV process in 1994. The significance of pointing that out is something that really distinguishes my son's situation from the students who were identified by Dr. Lindsay's previous study information. With respect to the original classic autistic disorder, cognitive disability was also a prominent feature. It wasn't an official diagnostic criteria, but the experts with the Centers for Disease Control in the United States have repeatedly pointed out that with the original classic autistic disorder, intellectual disability constituted the vast majority. Dr. Marsha Lynn Yergin-Alsup is the autism expert with the CDC, and she's used that very expression, the vast majority. So what does that mean in terms of inclusion? If you have a child with classic autistic disorder and, for example, cognitive disabilities, which constitutes the vast majority, what it means, it's a very serious complicating factor. What it means is if you put that together with sensory challenges, if you put that together with ritualistic, obsessive type of behaviors, which are also very commonly featured with this type of disorder at all levels, but certainly at the classic autistic disorder level, one of the significant results, and it's not an uncommon result at all, and my son suffers from this type of behavior, is called self-injurious behavior. SIBs, it's common enough that in autism discussions on the internet and in various journals, etc., SIBs are identified by acronym. Self-injurious behaviors are identified by acronym. As the very kind gentleman pointed out in the introductory remarks, my son, when he was starting the school system, in grade 2, close to the beginning of the year, would come home each day with self-inflicted bite marks on his hands and wrists. It didn't happen that much in grade 1, but in reality the challenges, I think, were not so substantial. We did remove him. Prior to removing him from the mainstream classroom, we actually also removed him from French as a language of instruction, a second language. Et c'est pas parce que j'ai quelque chose contre la belle langue de Molière, je peux parler un peu en français. J'habitais à le quartier Québec quand j'étais très jeune et j'ai pris des cours d'immersion à quelques opportunités. J'aime beaucoup. J'adore la langue française, but it's not the right thing to do necessarily for a child who has very fundamental communication issues, fundamental difficulty in grasping language at all as a concept, to put them into a second language learning environment. So In any event, we removed Connor before he even got into the French language class. What we did initially was accept the prevailing view that mainstream classroom inclusion would be beneficial for him. That was a false assumption. It was not beneficial for him. There's too much going on in the mainstream classroom for our son. I didn't even know then, and I only found out recently, that we have telephones that ring on occasion in our modern classrooms. I'm a dinosaur, and there's many ways I can prove I'm a dinosaur other than my gray hair. One of them is that when I went to school, there were no telephones ringing in the classroom. Sure, there was intercoms and so on, but there were no telephones going off in the classroom. And what's the significance of that in my son's case? Telephone ringing will cause him to engage in self-destructive behavior. The sound of it will do that for him. That's part of that sensory issues package that the previous speaker identified, and is also actually part of the new criteria definition of autism in the forthcoming DSM-4, which is will be the official diagnostic manual for the American Psychiatric Association. And what that means is that if he hears a phone ringing, he'll start hitting his head on the wall, he'll start biting his hands, he might smash the living room wall. Sensory issues are a huge challenge for some severely autistic children, and the sensory challenges of the mainstream classroom can result in self-injurious behavior. So that really, in a nutshell, is where I get to the point of saying that the mainstream classroom can cause harm to some autistic children. I would not even presume to suggest that it would remotely apply to all autistic children. There's I think it's a very clear distinction between low-functioning and high-functioning autism, although that's, like everything with autism, tends to be a matter of considerable debate. But certainly cognitive levels is one, the extent to which one engages in self-injurious behavior and doesn't understand basic social communication challenges. Those are all things that can distinguish low and high-functioning autism. And there's no question, beyond any doubt, that some higher-functioning autistic kids in particular can do very well in the classroom with some relatively minor adjustments. And to take this back to a bit of an historical perspective, I was very actively involved as a parent, along with other fellow parents, in the development of autism services in New Brunswick as we know them today. And when we started, there was very little in the way of autism-specific services. We fought like hell, pardon my language, but that's what it took to get things done. And what we got done was early intervention, 2 to 5, by well-trained people at a program that we helped lobby to get established at UNB in autism intervention training. We then advocated subsequently for the same process to take place in our school system, and we had some initial success as well in that regard. And that success included getting, if you look at the population of New Brunswick, you've got to put things in perspective. We had approximately 500 teacher assistants and resource teachers trained in autism intervention through the UNB program. And I will go to my deathbed thinking that was a huge success and contribution to the well-being of autistic students in New Brunswick. And in particular, I would like to emphasize the role of the education assistant. Because when I come to these events, I hear a great deal about the role of the teacher, and I respect immensely the role of the teachers in our schools. I had a lot of good relationships all through my school career with teachers, and I admire them. But the frontline people in dealing with my son in particular for autism is the education assistant. And they've been well trained to a substantial number. So we've had some very core successes. One of the areas we got a lot of feedback, a lot of kickback on, was the attempt to arrive at alternative locations for learning. And some of the people that are in this room have heard my message on this over and over, and I'm not pointing at you, Randy. But I've commented on this in a variety of forums on behalf of the Autism Society of New Brunswick, of which I am actually, again, the acting president as we reorganize, and I'll only be acting temporarily until we can find somebody else willing to become president for a while. But the point about that we made about the mainstream classroom is what I've just gone through. It just doesn't work for all autistic children. And I've talked about my specific son's situation. There are many other similar examples. And when it doesn't work, sometimes it's blamed on the student. They have a disorder. What seems to be impossible to grasp by some folks involved with, I don't know if you call it pedagogy or what the right word is, policy, is that the environment might just not be the right place for those kids. I've heard the word environment mentioned, but I haven't heard it explored in any significant way in most of these discussions. The assumption is always that mainstream classroom inclusion is good. And if you say that enough times and you repeat enough cliches about community and inclusion, that everything's going to work out just swell. And it doesn't. And when you're the father or mother of a severely autistic child who hurts himself because of where they've been placed in the classroom, you can't ignore that, and you can't swallow the Kool-Aid. You can't just go with the cliches. You can't allow your child to hurt him or herself. And that's why we fought with such determination. And it was the Autism Society's official perspective that yes, some autistic kids can and should be educated in the classroom, the mainstream classroom, but not all. And if you see a problem occurring, yes, it might be that child, you might have to address it, but it might be the environment they're in. It might be where they're learning. One of the solutions that's often suggested in dealing with the behavioral issues that can arise with autistic kids is the pullout. Guess what? 98% of the time, I would guarantee you what you're doing is counterproductive. Why? Because some autistic kids communicate not so much through words, even if they have that ability, but through their behavior. In many of those cases, when they're acting out, they're telling you they don't want to be there. You pull them out, and you're rewarding the behavior. And you may think that's a simplistic analysis, and I would agree that it's not 100% correct all the time, but it will be correct some of the time. And I'm speaking as a father who's had to learn to manage serious autistic behavior. I'm speaking as an advocate who's also been involved in the establishment of ABA programs in this province, and who's gone to class to learn ABA principles myself. So all I'm saying is don't buy the panacea that the mainstream classroom is the solution. That's a substitution. At the end of the day, we heard some brilliant legal minds here in the last couple days, of which mine is not one of them. But people like Uday Hentelef, who I had the privilege to finally meet because he's been such an inspiration to so many parents in this country. And as a blogger, I've communicated with people across this country. As a national autism advocate, I've met people across this country who have tremendous respect for Mr. Hentelef and who's argued for a range of learning options, including location. So you've really got to focus in on looking at what's in the best interest of the child, not does this support classroom inclusion. That is substituting the assumption that the mainstream is the best for every child for looking at the evidence as to whether or not that is the case. And I know I sound like I'm hitting a bit hard perhaps, but I'd like to shift gears a little bit if I've still got the time, because I want to show you something. This is a notebook that the education assistant that worked with my son in a separate area of the school, in an area outside the mainstream classroom where he receives his ABA-based instruction. She works with him directly. This was her final comment yesterday when I picked him up from school. And trust me, she knows what she's doing better than any classroom teacher that I know to date in New Brunswick schools. June 14th, this was yesterday, it has been a great year with Connor. He is such a joy to work with. He is such a hard worker and a happy child. Have a wonderful summer. See you in September for another great year. Now, that may sound like, well, so what? That's a big deal. That's a very big deal. This lady worked with my son all year in instructing him, and it's not easy. I know. I know the challenges of working with my son, and she did a great job. She's an education assistant. I wouldn't trade her for any teacher right now. No offense to the teachers, but she's got the training, she's got the experience, and she delivered the goods. And that letter is as good as anything. But I have one more thing I want to show you. My son arrives at Leo Hayes High School in Nashwaak-Sis, which is on the north side in Fredericton, and I mention it because I love Nashwaak-Sis. I love walking on our trails and environment. He goes to the resource center each morning where there are other kids with challenges, and some people stick their nose up at that. I don't. My son loves it there. He's been there, this is his second year working out of the resource center. He has at least 2 friends who have shown him attention on many occasions when I brought my son to school. He does other activities with other kids involved or not involved, depending on the activity, outside that resource center. He doesn't get his education there, it's a separate area. But he goes to the swimming pool, which is a nice-sized swimming pool in Nashwaak-Sis Middle School. He can swim like a fish. My son can swim like a fish. So when he's in that pool, there's no issues, there's no challenges. He can be around all the neurotypical, ordinary students and adults you want. Just let him in the water, no big deal. Or he can go down to the playhouse to see the recent play production that was put on by some fine students from Leo Hayes as well. And it was very well organized. The people from Leo Hayes Resource Center knew what they were doing. They had the kids from the resource center there. They knew how to manage them, how to look for any problems, and they had them in front row. And it was a wonderful experience. He's been out picking apples with other kids in the orchards in this area. He's gone to the golf and country club. He can do all kinds of things with other kids other than the kids in his resource center, but not for the individual instruction which he gets himself. And he loves the resource center. This is the proof right here. What is it? It's his lunch bag. Now, I told you that kids with severe autism sometimes communicate through behavior better than they do through language. He packs this lunch the night before every day without being asked to do it. Why does he do it? Because he wants to make sure that that lunch bag is there in the morning when he goes to school, because he wants to go to school. And sometimes you have to watch it, because if there's something in there that needs to be in the fridge, he'll put it in front of the door so that Dad doesn't forget to take it out to the car when he takes him to school in the morning. But that's a very effective way that he tells us what he thinks of the resource center and the education he's receiving at high school. And Connor's vote means a lot more to me than any philosophy of full mainstream classroom inclusion. I want to thank everybody. This is tough. I want to thank everybody at the Resource Center for the great job they've done. And I hope that that center doesn't become the victim of any overzealous ideologies in the next few years. And I'm very concerned about that. I've seen the Porter Aucoin report, and I'm not happy with what I've seen so far. What I see, and I haven't had a chance to study it thoroughly, but I will, and I will write about it on my blog. But what I've seen so far, I'm not impressed with. And I'll just use one simple example, that the focus on the education assistants is to sort of bring them back into line with the traditional model whereby they take instructions from the teacher, and it's the classroom teacher. It's the mainstream classroom teacher. There's nothing specific per se, but most of what I see when it adds up is just another drumbeat to return to the mainstream classroom for everybody. And what I see are sections which I think are clearly focused in that direction. When the constant references to leadership for inclusion, when the constant references are there to promote inclusion. The authors of that report have spoken publicly about inclusion. They've made statements like in referring to classroom inclusion, that it means being educated in the main regular classroom with their peers, chronological peers. That's a return to the past. There was a movie about that called Back to the Future. That's what that is, because that doesn't recognize the challenges of people and students like my son. Those education assistants have been well trained in this province. They know what they're doing. The regular classroom teacher doesn't. And I'm very concerned, and I've said so, that this is back to the future stuff. Yes, the classroom inclusion drive started a couple of years after the Charter of Rights, but I think there's been a couple of very learned lawyers comment on the Eaton case, because the Eaton case doesn't support the view, and I'm just a humble labor lawyer from New Brunswick, but some of the distinguished people involved have confirmed, in my opinion, my interpretation of Eaton, which is that you can't just take the classroom inclusion as the final result. You've got to look at the best interest of the child based on the evidence for that child. And when your evidence includes bitten hands and wrists, parents can't ignore that. We'd probably be charged if we did in most cases. Just imagine if a child was hurting himself in the home to that extent on a regular basis. You don't think social services would have them up questioning their ability to parent? You're darn right they would, because it's happened in Canada. There's a case going on for the last year out in BC about a child with autism who went missing, just briefly. Because wandering is also a problem with autism, and by that I mean it's been recognized in the United States as sort of a protocol. It's not part of the diagnostic criteria, but it's a protocol associated with autism. Well, this gentleman in BC, his daughter went missing for a couple of hours. She was found at the home, the pool, of a nearby neighbor, just within a couple hours. Well, this dad was home alone with his autistic son once, about 8 years ago. I'm a self-practicing lawyer. I took a business call on a Saturday, a phone call, and I was listening for my son to make sure he didn't leave the house while I was on the call. I didn't hear him go out. And when the call was over, I couldn't find him, and I was in panic. We lived close to a river. At that time, we lived near a parking lot with a shopping center at the end, including a tavern at the end closest to us, where people, I can tell you, people start drinking pretty early on a Saturday at some places. So I didn't know where my son was, and I had to call 911, and they were able to say exactly where he was because a good Frederictonian had stopped his vehicle when my son was trying to cross a busy street and took him in to the local Ultramar. I could have been subject to all kinds of allegations by social development and so on and so forth, but I wasn't. And I've commented on this publicly for several years. And yet there's a man in BC who's lost his custody of his daughter for the past year because of that. So what happens in the education system when they see students hurting themselves in the classroom? They just assign the responsibility to the child. They never think that it might be that environment that might be harmful. And they should. And I assign some responsibility to them in some cases for not doing it. How many? Done? A couple minutes?
1 minute.
I'll need 30 seconds to think what I was just about to say to finish off. But just to put it in a conclusion, then all I will say is that inclusion should not mean mainstream classroom inclusion by definition. you've got to look at the best interests of the child, and you've got to look at what the evidence says about that. As an autism advocate, I've met many autistic students and met their families. I cannot say that all autistic children shouldn't be in the classroom, and I wouldn't want to, because many of them can and want to and can do quite well, but not all of them. That's just not what the evidence says.